Hello, welcome to this presentation of around conscientious objector training. My name is Bill Galvin, and I work at the Center on Conscience and War in Washington, D.C. We are joined by Maria Santelli, who's the director of the Center on Conscience and War. And our job is to help conscientious objectors. The Center on Conscience and War was founded back in 1940 by Quakers and Mennonites and Brethren and Methodists to support conscientious objectors because of how badly they were treated during World War I. It's an awful part of our history that, well, we'll get into that in just a little bit. But as the country was gearing up for a draft for World War II, some of those churches felt that the way conscientious objectors have been treated was just horrible, and they wanted to make sure that there was some better protection in the law, and they lobbied to get better protection, and they created us to be an advocate and support for conscientious objectors. I myself was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam period, and I've been working to support conscientious objectors pretty much my whole life ever since then. And I think it's important work, and I'm really honored to be able to be here and be able to share this with you. Maria, you want to say a little bit?
Sure. Hi. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our work with you and to invite you to share in the work of supporting conscientious objectors. It is our privilege to do this work. We meet some of the most amazing and selfless and caring people that you could ever know. People who have taken the time to really reflect on their values and what it really means to be complicit in militarism. I've been with the Center on Conscience and War for just about 10 years exactly this week. So it's great to be with you. I'm going to be in this session just briefly and then step away, but you're in very capable hands with Bill Galvin. Thank you.
Well, yes, and it is. It's wonderful to do this work, and we do meet amazing people. I want to let you know that I'm not real savvy with this technology. Hopefully there won't be any glitches, but I want to alert you to that. And I also want to encourage you to get some paper and pencil handy, because we do have a couple of exercises that we would like you to do. Hey, this is for you. It's for yourself. For you to think through your own values and things like that. But we would encourage you to fully engage with some of these exercises we're going to do. Conscientious objectors have been around as long as there's been war. Okay, and there's references in ancient Greek writings. The ancient rabbis used actually believed that the earliest recorded provision for conscientious objection is actually in the book of Deuteronomy in the Bible. Some people debate that, but the reality is that as long as there's been war, there have been people who've been saying no to war. In this country, there have been conscientious objectors ever since the Europeans arrived, and even before the Europeans arrived, some of the Native American nations were pacifist. And so this is a long history. Some of the colonies before the United States was created provided for conscientious objection in their constitution or their laws. And I imagine you folks know that the state of Pennsylvania, was founded by William Penn, who was, trying to find a place where Quakers could be free to, be free from conscription, be free from being forced by their governments to participate in war. And so this is a history that goes all the way back. There is even some, there's actually at least one anecdote that we know about where some Quakers were conscripted during the Revolutionary War, and they refused to carry their weapon. And so muskets were forcibly tied to their back because they wouldn't carry them. And when George Washington heard about this, he sent those people home. So this is a part of our tradition, even though, you know, given how militarized our culture has become, a lot of folks don't often hear that. But it's really important that you know that this is a very important and really relevant part of our history. Okay, mean, there's so much that we could say. I mentioned, or I mean, we know that conscientious objectors have not always been thought of well by the government. You know, when a government wants to force its people to go to war, when there are people who say no because of my values, that's not really what the government likes. And they've been treated well, and they've been accommodated, tolerated, uh, punished, treated horribly throughout the years. In the US, we have our first recorded documentation of even though there was some limited provision during the Civil War, we also know of some documentation of conscientious objectors being abused and treated pretty horribly. But the biggest thing we know in our history is World War One. During World War One, during the draft in World War One, to be a conscientious objector, you had to be a member of a church that prohibited its members from being a part of war. And this church had to have this policy before the draft law was passed. And if you were such a person and you qualified, you were in the military, expected to do non-combatant military service. And so for many, many conscientious objectors, this was not an option. I mean, even though the law placed them in the military, their conscience, their religious beliefs, or their other values, and not all of them were religious, but many of the objectors were, basically said, I can't do this. And so there were thousands of conscientious objectors who refused orders and who were treated horribly as a way to try to convince them to go along with military orders and perform non-combatant military service. And the treatment that they received, some of them qualifies as torture, as what we would know as torture today. Early forms of waterboarding were in fact documented against some of these conscientious objectors. They reported having ropes tied around their neck and being dragged around rooms, being thrown through windows, being, submerged in cold water. I mean, it's just the kinds of things that we've heard about were just horrible. And for those who were not allowed, who said, I'm not going to wear a military uniform, they weren't allowed to wear civilian clothes either. And so they were kept in prison cells, basically naked. And a number of them caught pneumonia or some other kind of disease. We know of at least 30 conscientious objectors who died at the hands of the US Army during World War I. And that is why those churches, the Quakers being a key part of that, lobbied to get better protection in the law, and also created our organization to be an advocate and support for conscientious objectors. During World War II, things were still not perfect, but a lot better. And for the first time, they had work camps where conscientious objectors would, perform alternative. It was the first time that there was a non-military alternative service for conscientious objectors. And so if you'd have to apply before the draft board and hopefully get approved. But if you got approved, then you could work in in conservation work, and things like that. The law was it had to be work that was somehow in the national importance or of national significance. And a lot of the work wasn't, okay? They were doing things like building picnic tables or building trails in parks. I mean, there was also important work that was being done, fighting forest fires. But the conscientious objectors themselves really wanted to do, more than that, and really lobbied hard. Many of them wanted to actually go to the war zone to provide, relief to victims of the war. Um, not through the military, but through a non-military, presence. The U.S. government wouldn't allow that, but but through a lot of pressure, eventually they did allow other forms of service. And conscientious objectors worked in mental health hospitals. In many cases, they totally revolutionized the way mental health is done in this country, because many times when they went into the hospitals, the patients were being beaten and brutalized, and the conscientious objectors refused to do that. They exposed what was going on. They actually got the head of mental health for the state of Virginia fired because of the things that they exposed that were going on his watch. And so they made some really significant contributions to the world, and to this country in particular. They also were a part of medical experimentation. They actually were given malaria and other diseases, and various kinds of treatments were used on them to try to find out what kind of treatments would be best. They were given, lice and all sorts of other things that were problems that people were facing at the time. And they also, some of them, participated in hunger experiments. Part of the concern was, people who'd been living through the war, and who had been totally malnourished, because they could not get access to food. Those that survived, how do you nurse them back to health? And so there were conscientious objectors who actually went through experiments to, they were basically starved. They could never be alone, because they had to make sure they never ate. Somebody had to be with them all the time to make sure they didn't eat more than what they were allowed to eat. And then they tried to figure out how to nurse these folks back to health once they've been starved to the point of, I don't know if they were close to death or not, but they were in pretty bad shape. I mean, I actually talked to one of the folks who was a part of that experiment, and he said that what he was surprised to find was that the hungrier they got, the more aggressive they got, which I thought was a pretty interesting observation about the reality of hunger and its effects on people and how they're going to respond to various things. Okay, but these conscientious objectors volunteered to be a part of these experiments because they really wanted to make a difference and serve the world and the community, but they really didn't want to be a part of, you know, doing violence to people. And so that is some of that history from the World War II era. Um, the the military itself has done some research about conscientious objectors. And one of the things that it actually started in World War II, where General S.L.A. Marshall, he was the official Army historian for World War II. And he was doing some research and found out that in most units, fewer than 25% of the soldiers were shooting at people to kill, to try to kill them. And and he basically concluded that at the critical moment, the rifleman becomes a conscientious objector. That there is something, you know, that about a person that causes them to not want to kill another person. Well, they've ever since World War II, the military has been studying this. And there's actually a rather extensive book called On Killing by a guy named Grossman, who used to teach at West Point. And he did extensive research on this and found out it wasn't just in World War II, but from all wars that he could identify, this kind of thing happened. Excuse me, and this kind of thing happened. He found that was true in Napoleon's army. And in particular, he talked about um, Gettysburg, okay, where soldiers were, dead soldiers that were found on the field. When they would, retrieve their muskets, they would find there would be 6, 7, 8 or more musket balls in their musket. Okay, and he concluded, well, what explains this? What accounts for this? Well, back then you had to, I don't know exactly how it worked, but you had to put in the powder and tamp it down, and then you had to put in the ball and whatever before you could shoot. And so his conclusion was that soldiers were going through this action, pretending to shoot, and then going through the action again, because there would be some officer watching to make sure they were doing this. And so Grossman concluded that, there's basically, except for psychopaths, people have an aversion to killing other people. And because of that, the military has changed how they train people. And these days, part of the training is explicitly designed to override your conscience. And so, you know, and and you're taught basically to shoot as a reflex, having not had any, without even thinking about it. And at some level, it makes some sense, because if a soldier is deciding, well, should I fight or should I not? Should I shoot or should I not? In the meantime, they might get killed if you're, accepting war is the way to do things. Whereas if they just respond automatically by shooting, that's effective from the military's point of view. But the problem is you still have a conscience. And you may be aware of the high levels of suicide in the military. On average, one active duty military person commits suicide every day, and over 20 veterans a day commit suicide. And this is, it's attributed to PTSD, and to some degree that is a factor, but it's also attributed to something called moral injury, which is um, at the heart of it, you know, what you've done is wrong. You're following orders, you're going through your day-to-day activity, but somehow, in the heart of it, you know that what you're doing is wrong and you can't do it. And so that's an ongoing thing. And just so you know, we also work with conscientious objectors in the military. Um, I mean, and we've been talking about the term conscientious objector. Well, what is it? Well, a conscientious objector is somebody who objects to participating in war. Okay, that's basically uh, who it is. And this objection takes, many different forms. Some folks feel it's wrong to register with selective service, that's a way of participating in war. Other people feel that it's wrong to pay their taxes because half of your tax dollar supports the military in one form or another. And there are some conscientious objectors who deliberately live below, they impoverish themselves. They live below the taxable limit so that they won't have to pay for war. There are others who make more money who outright refuse to pay or take other, stances of resistance with the IRS. There are a lot of people who really think hard about where they're going to invest their money or where they're going to spend their money to try to make sure that they are not supporting companies or policies that somehow perpetuate violence. So conscientious objection takes many different forms. Now, in United States law, there are basically three places where conscientious objection is recognized. Okay. And the main place, and I think this is the foundation for the other places, is in the draft law, the selective service law. And the draft law says, this is a direct quote out of the draft law: nothing contained in this title shall require anyone, nothing contained in this title shall require any person to perform combatant training and service in the armed forces of the United States who, by reason of religious training and belief, is conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form. Okay, so that is a quote out of the draft law from 1940. That's still the law. And I should say that there have been some court cases that have, helped identify this and broaden this. And you don't have to be religious. Non-religious beliefs qualify as well, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, but that is the policy in terms of the draft. So if you are a conscientious objector, then you would not be forced to go into the military and fight. We're going to get into a lot more detail about that a little bit later on. But there's also a provision when people, okay, based on that draft law, the Pentagon has developed a policy for discharging people who become conscientious objectors, or reassigning them to non-combatant duties. And we will talk about that in a little bit also. The other place in US law where it appears is in immigration law, okay? You may not be aware of it if you were born here, but when folks become citizens, they have to swear to an oath of allegiance to the country. And part of that oath includes a pledge to basically bear arms if called upon by the government. And so because Quakers and other pacifists were seeking citizenship who could not take that oath, and there was actually a legal struggle on this back in the 1940s and 50s, but ultimately it became clear as a part of immigration law now that if you're a conscientious objector, there is an alternative oath that you can take that does not require you to make a pledge that you're going to be a part of the military and commit violence. But in terms of U.S. law, that's the three areas where conscientious objection is talked about. Of course, we're going to mostly talk about how to prepare and a packet and be a conscientious objector under the law, and it's going to be mostly focused on the draft because I think that is mostly what is going to be what you are concerned about. But that is the range of conscientious objector issues, conscientious objection in the law these days. Now, we would like to move into an exercise. Maria's back, I see. And so, yeah, if you got your paper and pencil out and ready for this, and this is really for your benefit to help you think through this process. But conscientious objectors have to submit a written application. And there's a couple of questions that are pretty central to the conscientious objector process. And we are going to go through them now. Now this exercise, after we put up each of these questions and explain them, I'm going to recommend that you put this on pause and take no more than 5 minutes to write your answer to it. And then we'll move on to the next question. Yes? Oh, you're muted, Maria.
While you're pulling that up, I just want to invite people. I mean, Bill just gave an excellent overview of the history, but I also want to invite people to our website, particularly our newsletter page, The Reporter for Conscience Sake. And the last few years, we've been really delving into the history of conscientious objection in this country. So there's a lot of rich content there about World War I, World War II, the civilian public service camps, and also the Korean era conscientious objectors.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Next, I think we should do Vietnam.
Yeah, we will. You can only do so much at a time, but yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So here's the first question. What do I believe about war and violence? Okay, it's asking you to describe in some detail and as honestly as possible the basic principles that guide your life, and and think about and describe those values which are of utmost importance to you, such as God or love or truth, life, things like that, and how and why these beliefs are in conflict. Well, are or are not in conflict with your participation in war. Obviously, for conscientious objectors, they would be in conflict, okay? But, do your best to write clearly and directly about, in your own words, what's coming out of your heart in terms of what you believe about participating in war, and describe those beliefs and that lead you to that kind of opposition or agreement with participation in war. So just take a few minutes to do that.
The second question, as Bill mentioned, these questions sort of summarize the questions that an actual conscientious objection application would include. So what's important, in addition to describing your beliefs, the beliefs that you currently hold, there's also a question about how those beliefs developed. So think about and take a few notes on how you developed your beliefs. If you are a conscientious objector, where you might fall on the spectrum of conscientious objection that Bill just described. So in answering this question, include anything of significance that helped you form your beliefs. Mention any religious training you have had if you feel such training has helped you arrive at your position. If you feel you arrived at your beliefs with no formal training, there's no need to mention any, but any influences that you might have had: clergy, teachers, family members, books, television, movies, memberships in organizations, podcasts these days. People are getting a lot of their media through their different devices, and other experiences in your life should be listed. Maybe you went to the Peace Corps, maybe you volunteered at a soup kitchen, maybe you trained in yoga, whatever it might be for you. If you have experienced war or training for war, and that was part of what moved you to be a conscientious objector, of course, reflect on that.
Mhm. And this third question is about how your beliefs guide your life. Now, I just want to remind you that the real issue is, what do you believe? Do your beliefs prevent you from participating in war? Well, how do you prove what you believe? Kind of by definition, a belief is something that can't be proven or disproven. So when you answer these other questions, the previous question about how your beliefs developed, and this question about how your beliefs influence your life, these are ways to help convince someone else that you sincerely believe what you say you believe. Okay, so this question is, how do my beliefs guide my life? Any public expression you've given, written or oral, that you can talk about your lifestyle, maybe talk about your life's goals, what you hope to do with your life once you're done your education and heading into the workplace, and show how these are an outgrowth of your values and your beliefs. Okay, take some of the best examples and talk about the kinds of employment that you have had or plan to have. Think about community service you've been involved with, if you're involved with a church or a mosque or a synagogue, if you're, various kind of clubs or sports that you choose to participate in or not participate in, and relationships. And don't forget to mention, the impact of movies and video games and what, whether, for example, if you don't really like violent movies or something like that, just try to think about ways that your values guide your life and give some examples of that.
Sometimes our complicity with militarism or complicity in militarism is a little more um, gray, shaded, or obscured in different ways. And so the second exercise that we'd like to do together is called Where Do I Stand? And again, reflecting on that spectrum of conscientious objectors that Bill talked about, and then just our own lives. How, in even unconscious ways, do our lives contribute to an increase in militarism in our world, or the perpetuation of militarism and war? What are some of our unconscious biases, maybe, that we haven't really contemplated on? So a former board member of ours who resigned his commission. He was an Army chaplain, Reverend Chris Antal. He's from the Philadelphia area. He's a chaplain at a Veterans Administration hospital right now, but he resigned in an open letter to the Obama administration because of his opposition to drone warfare, which President Obama has since said was too easy to engage with. So what are some, he wanted to explore what are some of those things that we allow to occur in the world very easily, that we agree with and we're not even aware of. So we're going to go through a series of questions here and jot down on your paper or just make a mental note, and you guys can maybe touch on some of this later in the live sessions. Where do you stand? And after each statement, decide, do you strongly agree? Do you disagree? Do you strongly disagree? Do you disagree? Do you agree? Strongly agree? Or have no opinion?
Okay. And we'll just take just a short time with each of these.
So you don't have to pause necessarily. And there's 14 questions.
Okay, so let's, whoa, what did
Go
I
back.
do?
Go back.
Do that.
Scroll up and find slide 5. There you go.
Where do I stand? And then, okay, now, I would never intentionally kill another person under any circumstances.
Sometimes killing another person can be an act of love.
I can name a just war.
The US would be justified in engaging in wars for resources such as water, arable land, oil, etc.
God is the biggest killer in the Bible.
War may be necessary to protect our borders from climate refugees.
Mhm. Sometimes God uses the military to carry out God's will on earth.
The United States should not have a military at all.
Every adult US citizen should be required to do military service.
I feel some responsibility for the killing done by the US military.
In warfare authorized by legitimate authority, one person is not the killer, but the group is.
I belong to the group that kills.
I can belong to the group that kills and still belong to the church or be a good person.
I can support others to train to kill and still be a good Christian or a good person.
Well, those were designed to help you think about these issues. And I don't know, Maria, did you want to add anything here?
No, again, I just want to say that it might be interesting to hold on to your notes. And then when you're in the live session or the live sessions over the coming days, maybe folks want to describe their impressions and how that felt to go through that. It's a challenging exercise. It can be a challenging exercise and very thought-provoking, we hope.
Yes. And just so you know, these are some of the kinds of questions that conscientious objectors get asked. And well, I mean, we'll get into this a lot more, but you know, when I went before my draft board, they seemed to know every kind of passage in the Bible that might seem to support war, and you know, threw that at me. You know, so so it's important that people who are conscientious objectors think about these issues.
And I think it's such an interesting exercise that very few of us do. Of course, if you're part of a faith group, maybe you have contemplative time, or if that's just who you are, a meditative and contemplative person, maybe you have thought about these things in more than superficial ways and really contemplated on these issues deeply. But many of us haven't. And I always say the CO application is great and everyone should do it because it really does help you get in touch with what your values are, and then really, you know, check yourself. Am I living true to my values? You know, we know what it feels like when our conscience nags at us, whether it's just through an argument with somebody that you love, you know, you didn't behave at your best and that nags at you. So that's an everyday thing, you know. What about your participation in whether it's implicit or complicit or explicit, your participation with militarism and the perpetuation of war in our world. So we're grateful that we've had the opportunity to share this exercise with you. With that, I'm going to turn the floor totally back over to Bill now, and I appreciate your community in this process.
All right, take care, Maria. Okay, yes, well, I mean, as I'm sure you all know, it's been 50 years since, almost 50 years since anyone was drafted in the United States. We haven't had an active draft since the Vietnam period. However, since 1980, young men have been required to register for the draft. And you should know that there's currently conversation that might expand that requirement to women as well. There's been a lot of talk in Congress about that. So even though nobody's been actively drafted, the draft still has been a factor that has impacted, you know, many people. And there's a lot of folks who have not registered. Okay, according to the Selective Service's own research right now, they've got about a 92% compliance rate, which means 8% of the folks who are required to register are not registering. And that can have pretty serious consequences, okay? And as I mentioned at the very beginning, you know, some of those people are conscientious objectors, okay? I mean, since the definition of a conscientious objector under US law, you know, is someone who's opposed to participation in war in any form. That's actually the wording in the law. And there are some conscientious objectors who say, well, registering for the draft is a form of participation in war, and my conscience won't allow me to do that. Now, there are other reasons why people don't register, you know, mistrust of the government, you know, feeling that, I mean, for a lot of folks, it's ignorance, you know, just not even being aware of the requirement and the consequences. You know, but for for a lot of folks, this is a matter of conscience, and it's important that we talk about what the consequences of failure to register are. Okay, because failure to the register and any violation of the draft law, I might add, it could be a federal felony. I mean, it is under the law a federal felony. If you were prosecuted and convicted, the maximum penalty is 5 years in jail and $250,000 fine. Now, no one has ever been fined $250,000. Doesn't seem to make sense to fine somebody that kind of money when they don't have that money. But and to be honest, nobody's been prosecuted since January of 1986. So anybody who's now facing draft registration, the last prosecution was before they were born, and we do not see that that's likely to change in the immediate future unless they actively do bring back an active draft. We do not see any evidence that that's going to happen at this point in time, but one can never predict the future, so we don't know. What we do know is that Selective Service is geared up and ready to go, and and presumably would be ready to get draftees into the military within a relatively short period of time. And it's also likely that if that were to happen, then prosecutions would also start to happen. But at this point in time, we're not seeing anything that's going to change that. But you never know for sure. Okay, but so even though no one has been, and I should say that since 1980, when the registration started, there were about 20 people. Well, there were lots of non-registrants. There were hundreds of thousands, by this point, many millions of men who are required to register have not registered. And in the early days of the registration, when they started it again in 1980, there was a lot of public opposition to registration, as we suspect there would be a lot of public opposition to women being required to register if Congress were to make that decision in the near future. And the government initially decided we're going to prosecute a handful of people, get a lot of publicity about this, and that's going to scare everybody else into registering. And so they did. They prosecuted a total of 20 people, but it backfired. Okay, Rusty Martin was one of the people who was prosecuted. He was, I forget if he was president of the senior class or president of the student body at the Iowa State University, but he was like your all-American guy off the farm who was saying, I'm not registering for the draft because it's wrong. My religious beliefs, tell me that I should not be part of killing people. And so he's on the evening news while he's being prosecuted, talking about why he didn't register. And they found out that non-registration increased when they started prosecuting people, because people realized they had a choice, realized that there was a moral component to the issue of registration. Same thing happened in San Diego, where they prosecuted 2 people. San Diego is a big military town, but same thing. They had these folks on the evening news talking about why they weren't registering, and non-compliance increased. And so the government decided to stop prosecuting people, and instead they started passing a bunch of other laws to try to coerce compliance with the draft and with the draft registration. And the first of these laws, which is referred to as the Solomon Amendment because of the member of Congress who had first introduced it, it basically linked draft registration with getting federal financial aid. And you probably remember this when you filled out your FAFSA for getting financial aid to come to college. There was a question on there about draft registration. And so that was the first of these laws. And by the way, the FAFSA, there was a law passed this year, the FAFSA streamline law, something like that. But starting in the summer of 2023, that will no longer be a part of the FAFSA application unless Congress changes their mind again. But as of now, that's scheduled to end eventually. But then they passed another one requiring draft registration to get federal job training. And they passed another law requiring that you register for the draft to work for a federal executive agency, which is most federal jobs. It includes it includes the post office. It includes the EPA, the National Forestry, the Forestry Service. So the kinds of things that people of conscience might be inclined to do if they want to work for the government doing this work, they would be required to register for the draft. To get this now these laws, and I should add that, okay, so that's what happened at the federal level. But then the Selective Service started encouraging, states to adopt similar kind of laws. And by now, most states in the country, I think over 40, have passed at least one of these kind of laws, and many of them have passed several of these kind of laws. But the first one that happened was linking draft registration to getting financial aid from the state. And then, to go to college. And then some states actually said, if you even want to go to a state university, even if you want to pay your own way and you don't want a scholarship, you can't register for the college unless you've registered for the draft. So that happened that's only a few states did that, but a couple states did that. Some states have made it a requirement to get employment with the state government. And there's some municipalities that have done that too. Some cities that have said you have to be registered for the draft to work for the city. And the other really big one that's been coming on in the last 20 years is linking draft registration with getting a driver's license. And so more and more states now say, there's a few states that when you apply for a driver's license, there's a box where you can check it to get registered for the draft. But most of the states require registration to get a license. And the way that is normally implemented is just by applying for a driver's license, you are agreeing that you will be registered for the draft. And so one of the things that we've found at the center is we started getting calls from people who saying, well, I got a registration acknowledgement from Selective Service, but I didn't register. Well, in almost all cases, they did register. They just didn't realize they registered because they filled out, some government form that got them registered. Now, the reason I'm pointing all of this out is because, if you are someone whose conscience prevents you from cooperating with Selective Service, and this is a stance you're going to take, then you need to be careful about anytime you fill out any kind of government form, because you need to read the fine print to make sure that you're not getting registered against your will. Now, of course, be aware that there's consequences to not registering, and and we'll certainly do all we can to help folks who are affected by those policies. But there are consequences that we don't have any control over. This is what the government sets out. And so one of the reasons I bring all of this up is to help you understand that there are, actually, one of the interns we had a number of years ago, and it's not just a driver's license, by the way. The agent, if you're in a state that requires it, it's also for a learner's permit or a photo ID. So even if you decide I don't want to get a driver's license because that's a compromise on my values, even if you get a photo ID from the state, then that would register you if you're in one of those states. And we actually had one of our interns a number of years ago who lived in Virginia, which required this to get a driver's license. What he did was he got a passport, so he had a photo ID, and he did not get a driver's license until he was beyond draft registration age, so so that he would not be affected by that, which is a major inconvenience in his life because everybody else could drive, and Virginia doesn't have the greatest of public transit, so he was at a real disadvantage. But that's the kind of, I mean, he's acting out of his conscience. He's accepting that there's going to be certain inconveniences in my life because of the government laws about trying to force us into the war or the military, or that that I have to. There are certainly consequences of me being true to my conscience and not going along with that. Now, I should also tell you that there are alternative sources of aid for people. I mean, to be honest, needing government aid is, there's a lot of government aid available. And so it may, so usually there is a financial sacrifice for people whose conscience won't allow them to register to get financial aid. But, and I have not checked with, these three schools, Haverford and Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr recently, but I know that way back they had policies, and as did many of the schools that were affiliated with the historic peace churches, that would provide alternative sources of aid for people whose conscience won't allow them to register and therefore cannot get financial aid. And there are a number of schools that have at least have that as a policy, but it may be, and I know it was on the books at these schools, but if it has not been asked for in a long time, that people in the financial aid office may not even be aware of it. So that is something else you need to think about if you're in that position yourself. Now, the Center on Conscience and War, we actually do administer a fund on behalf of a handful of peace groups. It's called the Fund for Education and Training, which is a loan fund. It's a revolving loan fund for conscientious objectors who cannot, in good conscience, register and therefore can't get financial aid for school. So if you're in that category, you could certainly be in touch with us. And then there's other schools that like Princeton University. This is an interesting thing. Now, Princeton universities would say, well, we don't have a policy in response to this selective service issue, but our policy is that we will meet 100% of a student's demonstrated financial need. And if that student does not qualify for federal aid, then they have that much more financial need that we have a commitment to trying to match. So for a student whose conscience will not allow them to register, it'll be difficult, but there may be some options. And but I just wanted to alert folks that is an issue. And we're talking about registration, and registration is what triggers or doesn't trigger these various benefits from the government. But the other thing to keep in mind is that according to the selective service law, once you have registered, you are required to notify selective service within 10 days every time you move, okay? And selective service's own research has indicated that almost nobody does that, okay? And so there's no real consequence. I mean, they're not in any way enforcing that. So there are folks who register so they can get the financial aid and things, and they just move on with their life and don't have anything to do with selective service anymore. And it would be difficult for selective service to find them if there ever was a draft. But you need to know that according to the law, what is currently required of men is register within a 60-day period that begins 30 days before you turn 18. And failure to register during that window of time is a violation of the law. And even though, so when people have not registered, selective service does computer cross checks with various agencies or finds out about people through driver's licenses. And they'll send letters to folks saying, hey, you haven't registered, you need to register, you're going to be facing all these consequences, including prosecution. And if you register, a year, like when you turn 19, then you decide, well, yeah, I better register because I need financial aid or whatever it is. You have still violated the law by not registering when you're supposed to register. But their policy has been to not prosecute anybody for that. And since Selective Service has repeatedly said that their objective is to get people to register, then it would be counterproductive for them to start prosecuting people who they convinced to register late, because then people are going to say, well, why should I register? They're going to prosecute me anyway. But like I say, nobody's been prosecuted since 86, the beginning of 86. And at this point in time, we don't see prosecutions as an option. But people who don't register would get a series of letters from Selective Service. And each might sound a little more threatening, and they eventually send you one that says, well, because you haven't registered, I mean, you need to register by such and such a date, or we're going to turn your name over to the Department of Justice for investigation and possible prosecution. And that's the letter that causes people to freak out some and call us. That letter simply means that you are one of millions of other people who they're going to turn over to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has not done anything with these letters, I mean, with this list of names since 1986. So any of these letters from Selective Service that are threatening prosecution are not really, do not mean that you're about to be prosecuted. If someone were to get a letter from a U.S. attorney on Department of Justice letterhead, and nobody's gotten a letter like that for Selective Service since the 1980s, okay? But if that were to happen, that could be a sign that the Department of Justice has decided to start prosecuting people. But as of now, we see no signs that that's going to happen. Now, there are people. Now, the question is, well, I mean, I mentioned there are people who object to, registering because they view it as a participation in war, in a form of participation in war. But there's other reasons as well. I mean, the Pentagon has, and the Selective Service, they and the government, various government agencies, have interpreted high levels of registration compliance as indicating support for U.S. military policies. And that's actually one of the reasons why some people haven't registered. They may not themselves be conscientious objectors per se, but they say, I don't want my doing this to somehow be interpreted that I support a belligerent foreign policy. And so that is one of the reasons why folks choose not to register. Yeah, and although there have been many statements along those lines over the years, going back to the 80s when the registration started, just a year, like 2 years ago, when basically there was a commission studying the future of Selective Service, and several representatives, from the Pentagon testified before this commission. And one of the things they said was, we rely on the draft registration, to know that we have a steady stream of people that we could call upon, if we needed to. And so it allows us to, maintain a foreign policy in which, contemplating military action is on the table. And so there are folks who are saying, I can't really let myself be used in that way, and so I won't. Okay, so those are that's a lot of the reasons why people of conscience don't register. But there's also folks who, maybe like some of you, who say, well, yeah, I feel that way, but I also need money to go to college and things like that. And so what am I going to do? And so So one of the options that we help people with and would encourage people who feel that way to do would be to register as a conscientious objector. Now, you need to understand that selective service regulations do not allow anyone to officially register as a conscientious objector. But there are some things that people can do to try to get on record from the time they are required to register for the draft. And one of them would be, okay, I mean, like I mentioned, there's lots of ways that people get registered: filling out a financial aid form, applying for a driver's license, maybe some other government form. Selective Service also allows you to go onto their website and register. You can even call them on the telephone and register. But what we recommend is if you're a conscientious objector and you want to get on record, you should register the old-fashioned way, which is go to the post office and get a registration card, which is supposed to be at post offices. I understand that a lot of post offices don't have them, but they're supposed to. Or you could go to the Selective Service website, which is sss.gov, G-O-V. So sss.gov. And if you go to their registration link, I mean, and don't fill out the registration right there, but there, if you scroll down, you eventually find where a registration card you could print out and then fill it out yourself. But on that printed form, you could write above your signature, "I am a conscientious objector," or words to that effect. And of course, you want to keep a photocopy of that before you submit it. We recommend that you send it certified mail, return receipt requested. I haven't checked in a couple years, but it was around $7 or $8 the last time I checked to do that. And what that means is that there is a postcard that would be attached to the outside of the envelope. And as it's being delivered, someone from Selective Service would have to sign that postcard. And then the letter carrier would tear it off and mail it back to you. And if you have that signed receipt, this has already been determined by the courts. It is proof that they received something from you on that date. And if they don't have what you sent them, it's presumed to be what you say it is. So take your signed receipt, staple it or attach it to your photocopy of the card you sent in, and you have proof that would stand up in court if necessary that you tried to get on record as a conscientious objector as of the time you registered. Now, once you register, within a matter of, it should happen within a month. I don't know if it always does, but it's supposed to happen within a month. You should get a registration acknowledgement, which is a computer printout that that includes all the information that you had. It's basically confirms that you registered, gives you a Selective Service number, and there's attached to it a form that says if anything is incorrect, please let us know, let us know immediately, or something like that. So it will not say anything about you registering as a conscientious objector. It's only going to have information on there that Selective Service is asking for. It will have nothing about the CO status. So what you could do is you could write on that change of information form, I register as a conscientious objector. You've apparently made a mistake by not including that in your records on me. So I request that you, correct your records. They're not going to, okay? They're not going to do that. But they will probably send you a form letter that says something like, "We are not accepting, information about classifications at this point in time, but if the draft ever does start, you will be given an adequate amount of time to file and document your claim." Okay, first of all, adequate amount of time in their mind means a week or so. Okay, so we'll get back to that. We'll get to that later. Uh, but but equally important, hang on to that letter. Okay, that is further proof that you tried to get on record as a conscientious objector. And in fact, that is one of the important things we want to talk about starting a CO file, a conscientious objector file. And this is, it doesn't have to be a file folder, but it could be. It could be a shoebox. It could be a corner of your room, as long as you keep everything safe and hang on to it. But when you want to collect things that are evidence of your beliefs, okay, and or things that show that you are acting in ways that are consistent with your CO beliefs. And so, so part of that would be the photocopies of the things you did at the time of registration. Um, you know, a part of that might be your answers to some of those questions we did at the beginning of this session, where you show that you seriously are thinking about some of these issues. But it would be all sorts of other things too. I mean, when my son was young, we were at a demonstration, and I got pictures of me and him with the signs when he was, he was really little at that point. So obviously he was mostly there to hang with dad. He wasn't there to, on his own, making a political statement. But that's evidence of how he was raised and the kind of influences that were brought to bear on him when he was young. When my daughter was in high school, she organized a peace demonstration in her town that made the local news. And there's even a picture. So I've, cut that article out. We saved that. That's evidence of her, doing things that are consistent with her CO beliefs. But it doesn't have to be political demonstrations. You volunteer at a soup kitchen, or, at an old folks home, or any number of things, do an environmental, getting involved in the neighborhood cleanup, just things that show that your values about improving the world and, and benefiting society, in ways that are not about violence. All of that stuff. It should be just keep it all in a file somewhere, because if at some point later you are applying for conscientious objector status, as I said earlier, although the issue is your beliefs, how do you prove what you believe? And so, doing all these things that you can then point to are really evidence that you must be sincere about this. And so that's one of the reasons we do this at the registration, is because you can show that from the time you first registered with Selective Service, the very first time you had to interact with this agency, you tried to make a stand and tried to get on file. And I should add that if you already registered and you didn't do that, it's not too late. You could do it now. You could write a letter to Selective Service saying, give your name and your Selective Service number. And by the way, if you don't know your Selective Service number and you registered, you can go to the Selective Service website. It's sss.gov. And there's a place on there where you can find your registration number. And so, send a letter with your name, sign it, put your Selective Service number on it, and basically say, look, I'm a conscientious objector, and I want you to reflect this on the files you keep on me. The same thing, they're going to respond saying, we don't do that, but you want to keep all of that. But even if you didn't do it at the time of registration, if you do it now, you're still showing you're taking a stance before there was any evidence that you were going to be drafted. Okay, so because one of the issues that the draft board's going to be thinking about whenever you apply for conscientious objector status and go before them would be, well, how do we know you're not just making this up to avoid getting drafted? And so if you can do things now that show that you are a conscientious objector, and then that's at least proof that you're not making it up now that you're drafting you. It was important to you to get on record this way because of your values. Okay, so that's one of the things we strongly recommend. So I think that covers how to register as a conscientious objector. And in terms of the CO file that I mentioned, also if you're members of, there are various peace groups like the War Resisters League or the Fellowship of Reconciliation, If you're involved with a church, many churches have peace fellowships. And so, and there's other groups too. A lot of local communities have a peace center or whatever. So if you have, if you're involved with any of those things or joined any of those things, keep track of that stuff, because these are all things that you can point to as evidence of your beliefs, if ever you are drafted. Which leads me to another really important point that that we need to bring up. There is currently, I mentioned earlier that there's a proposal that would expand the draft to include women. And that is something that might happen, this year in Congress. We hope not, but, we're doing all we can to prevent it. But, more and more, it's looking like that might be a possibility. However, there is also legislation, and it's bipartisan legislation in both houses of Congress, that would repeal the Selective Service Act. And this bill, first of all, not only would it end the draft registration, but it would also end all these penalties, that are affecting people. And I didn't mention this earlier, but okay, if you haven't registered for the draft and you're now 20, you can register for the draft and then get whatever those benefits are that you were not able to get. Once you turn 26, you can't. And although some of the state laws are different, the federal legislation is really clear. If you haven't registered by the time you turn 26, you are permanently barred from federal jobs, those federal jobs in executive agencies. You're permanently barred from financial aid. And so there are millions of men who are permanently barred because they did not register when they were supposed to, and now they're too old to register. They don't even have the option of registering if they wanted to. So these bills that would repeal the Selective Service Act would also end all these penalties for all the people who have not registered. So this is a really important piece of legislation that we strongly urge you to support and contact your members of Congress as soon as you can. Urge them to either co-sponsor it or support it. And these bills in the House, it's HR 2509. And in the Senate, it's S1139. Okay, but these are the bills. I'll repeat that. It's HR 2509. HR stands, I think, for House Resolution or something like that. HR 2509. And the Senate bill is S1139. They are identical, and they have bipartisan support in both houses. And that is our best hope for ending all of this nonsense, and which is what we would like to see. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it would be to make your thoughts known if you're so inclined. If you feel that it would be a good public policy to end this selective service system and end these penalties that we've been talking about, then contact your members of Congress and support HR 2509 and S 1139. Okay, so I think that covers most of the draft registration and things that are going on now that are affecting people as of this point in time. And on Saturday, when we have time together, if you have any more questions about this, I'll be happy to talk with you and answer any questions that you have. So what we're going to talk about from here on is what happens if they actually do resume the draft. As I said, we're hoping this will never happen. We're hoping we can get the entire system shut down before that point. But if the draft were to start, there are regulations that are in place. There's procedure manuals in place. I don't know if you know this, but there are draft boards in every county throughout the country. I could say that they've been trained, but it's questionable how well the training has taken. Let me just say that. Um, I mean, it's to be honest, the fact that they have trainings is an improvement over the way it was the last time we had a draft. Because during the Vietnam War, draft boards were not trained, and they did all sorts of horrible things in terms of not following the regulations and turning down legitimate conscientious objectors and things like that. But there are trainings now, so there is at least an effort to make sure that the draft boards know what they're doing. We have friends who are on draft boards, and although I personally could never be on a draft board, I'm opposed to the draft myself. You know, if you are someone who feels you could, in conscience, serve on a draft board, it might be worth pursuing, because it'd be important that there are people who have some understanding of and sympathy with the conscientious objector position on draft boards, so that when conscientious objectors come before them, they get a fair hearing. Most draft boards are veterans. Most members of draft boards are veterans, and their motivation typically is patriotism, and I mean, maybe they have some understanding and appreciation for CO position, but a lot of times they don't. Okay, and so that'll be important, and I think it's worth mentioning here that there is training. So there is an attempt by selective service to ensure that the draft boards treat people fairly, and we we work, I mean, we know the people at Selective Service National Headquarters, and they do seem to me to be decent and conscientious people, even though I disagree with what they're doing. And they certainly seem to be concerned about the system working fairly and treating people the way they should be treated. I do believe that that is the intent of the folks at headquarters. Uh, but I'm not certain that that always seeps into the boards, the draft boards, and they're the folks that are going to be dealing with conscientious objectors. And I can just tell you that we, like I say, we know people who are on draft boards. They talk to us about their experiences, and and just one of them told me not too long ago. He said, we did this training, we had a training, and the trainers from Selective Service, going through the whole process, and there was a simulated conscientious objector case, which was not exactly a stereotypical case, but it was somebody who clearly qualified under the law, and the draft board, in making this decision, was going to turn this guy down. And this guy who did understand CO said, no, he qualifies. And the trainer from Selective Service also said to the board members, he qualifies. But it was like pulling teeth to get the other board members to agree to recognize him as a conscientious objector. And so although there is some training, and that's good, I am not convinced that I'm personally convinced that probably the draft boards are going to continue to make a lot of bad decisions like they did in the past. There are some appeals, and we're going to get into all of that as we get into the process. But I just wanted to alert you that Selective Service does want it to be fair, and ultimately the appeals could end up land at the national level where people are trying to be fair, but if you don't appeal properly to get it up to that point, there could be a lot of injustice that happens if the draft were to return. But let's talk a little bit about what will happen if the draft returns. I mean, first of all, it would have to take an act of Congress. Okay, well, right now the entire draft law is in effect, except for the power to actually draft people. And so Congress would actually have to pass a law authorizing the president to draft people. And then the president would have to act on that authorization and say, yes, we're going to resume the draft. And that would happen before anybody could be drafted. Now, there's actually a couple of different procedures that Selective Service has in place. One that was developed in the 1980s and another one that was developed in the 1990s. They're the same in many respects, but they are different in some important respects. And the reason I bring all of this up is because the system that was developed in the 80s is the system that is supported by Selective Service regulations. The system that was developed in the 90s, which they say they intend to use, well, they haven't changed the regulations to support that system. Okay, so it's a little unclear exactly what Selective Service is going to do, but we know what the two plans are, and basically under the 1980s scenario, which is the system that they say they are not going to use, but it's also the system that is supported by the regulations. So they would have to change the regulations if they wanted to use this other system. And they've had, what, 30 years or more to change the regulations, and they haven't. Okay, so under this system, let's call day one the day Congress decides to draft people. And the president says, yes. Day two, they're going to hold a lottery. Okay, and I guess let me explain that under both systems. Okay, there's a lottery system. Part of the issue is how do you decide who's going to get drafted? We're not going to draft everybody, and so they've kind of turned. Okay, basically the way it's going to work is they are going to hold a lottery every year for the people who are turning 20 during the upcoming year. So that would mean in January of that year, most of them are 19 years old. And so, okay, so they're going to basically hold this lottery in which they assign a number to a birth date. So every birth date will get a number between 1 and 365. Or 366 if you were born in the leap year. And then when they start drafting people, they're first of all going to draft the people turning 20 during that calendar year. And they will start drafting the people who got the lottery number of 1. So you get whatever lottery number is assigned to your birthday. Okay, so first they're going to draft all the 1s. Then they're going to draft all the 2s, and then all the 3s, and so on. Okay, so that's basically how it works. Okay, no matter which system they use, they'll use the lottery system to decide who gets drafted first. Now, during the 1980s scenario, let's call day one the day Congress authorizes induction and the president says, yeah, we're going to draft people. On day two, they'll hold the lottery. On day three, they're going to send out induction orders, orders to report for induction to people who lose the lottery. And the regulations say that there must be at least 10 days between the time they issue you an induction order and the date that you are scheduled to report. And according to their plans under this system, they, at least at the beginning, they might give people more time later, but at the beginning, they're going to give the minimum amount of time. So that's 10 days. So 10 days later, on day 13, the first people drafted will report to something called MEPS. MEPS stands for Military Entrance Processing Station. It is it's where people go now. If you were going to join the military now, after you work out everything with a recruiter, you would go to MEPS to get your physical and go through all the final processing to go into the military. And so they're going to use those same stations, those same military establishments to send draftees to. So the first people drafted will go to the MEPS, have their physical, and if they pass everything at the MEPS, they will be drafted into the military that day and sent off to boot camp. That's just less than 2 weeks from the day Congress authorizes induction. Like I say, the government says they're not going to use that system. At the same time, that's what their regulations support. Okay. Now, under the, and let me just say that if you're a conscientious objector, or if you qualify for some other deferment or exemption like hardship or something like that, you must file your claim. You can't file your claim until after they issue you your order to report for induction. And you must file your claim by the day before you're scheduled to report for induction. So we're talking about a very narrow window of time here. And it's 10 days from the day your induction order is issued, not from the day you get it. Okay, so so you would need to be able to respond very quickly, because the regulations say if you don't apply during that window of time, then you waive your right to whatever it is that you would otherwise qualify for. Okay, so if you're a conscientious objector, even if you did all that stuff we talked about around registration, if you don't file do your initial filing during that little window of time, then you waive your right to the conscientious objector classification. So it's going to be really, really important to be able to respond very quickly. Now, let me just say that filing a claim at that point mostly just means, you know, checking off a box and submitting a form. Okay, it's not requiring a whole lot out of you, but you do need to respond in that time period. And if you do respond by applying for a deferment or an exemption or conscientious objector status, then your induction date would be delayed. And then they would send you the form. At that point, they would send you the conscientious objector form, but they would only give you about 10 days to fill it out and send it back. And then that would delay your being drafted until they make a final decision about whether you would get conscientious objector status or some other deferment or exemption. So that's under the emergency 2-week scenario that they developed in the 1980s, that they say they're not going to use, but this is what the regulations support. Okay. The system they say they're going to use, but they haven't changed the regulations to support it, would be similar, but a little different. It would anticipate, say, a 6-month lead time. So there would then be some notice and some warning, and you'd have a chance to get your act together knowing it was coming. So that's a big improvement. And then when they do hold the lottery and draft the first people, they won't be sending you an order to report for induction. What they'll be doing is sending you an order to report to the MEPS, that same place where you go to be drafted, but for an examination. Okay, they would send you there to be checked out by the military to see if you qualify. They actually expect that 70% of the people will not qualify. And Selective Service plans to send out 5 induction orders for every 1 person that they expect to draft. So it's a good chance people are going to fail the physical or be found disqualified in some other way. Okay, but according to the system they say they're going to use, okay, they'll order you to report to the MEPS, and you'll get your physical. And then if you are found qualified for military, if you flunk the physical, you'll be given a deferment, a medical deferment or whatever. It's a classification that they call 4F, and you won't be drafted. But if you pass the physical, then you will be classified 1A, which means available for unrestricted military service. And you will be told that they are supposed to then give you information about deferments and exemptions or conscientious objector status. And you will be given 10 days to file an initial claim, which is, again, a very quick thing of checking off the boxes on the form and sending it in. Okay, but just like before, if you do not file during that 10 days that they give you, you waive your right to anything that you qualify for. And if you don't file for something during that 10-day period, then you will most likely be drafted into the military very shortly after that. Okay, so that's basically the system that they say they're going to use. So it's a little better than that 2-week scenario we laid out at first. But if you're not prepared to respond quickly, then you could find yourself in the military without having given it a whole lot of thought. So it's important you be ready for that. And initially, like I say, it's just checking off a box saying that I'm a conscientious objector. If you do that, then Selective Service will send you the conscientious objector form. And the conscientious objector form that they're going to use today. I mean, again, keep in mind, any of this could change, but these are the plans as of today. The conscientious objector form has basically 3 questions. And they are the 3 questions we used at the very beginning of this workshop. Okay, those 3 questions about what do you believe? How did your beliefs develop? And how do your beliefs influence your life? Okay, and so those are basically the important questions that conscientious objectors will have to answer to apply for conscientious objector status. And you're only going to be given another 10 days to fill this out and send it back. And it's going to be really important to meet those deadlines, because if not, they can decide that you've abandoned your claim and they won't consider giving you conscientious objector status. And so obviously, I mean, I know you thought about it and wrote up a little bit of thought of, at the beginning of this workshop, but you need to take these questions seriously. And you need to really, delve into, these things and explain them more than just a paragraph. I think you need to give a thorough explanation about, what you believe, how those beliefs developed, and how those beliefs influence your life. And since you're only going to have a short amount of time to do that, if there's a draft, that's why we recommend it's important to do it now. And if you want to write up your beliefs, you could send them to us at the Center on Conscience and War. We would give you feedback on them. We would keep them on file if you would like. And my guess is that many Friends meetings would do the same thing. And my guess is there'll be people at your colleges that are going to be trained to help you with this, if it were to come to that process. And we're going to do more of that. We're going to get in a lot more detail about this next week. But it'd be really important to kind of write that stuff up now, because then if you do end up in that situation where you got to write it up real quick, I mean, maybe in 2 years when you're getting drafted, you will think a little bit differently about it, but you'll have a document to work from that you can revise. Whereas if you're starting from scratch, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And as you may already know from the initial questions you had to ask, you have to sit down and write, what is it that I believe? It'd be one thing to do a term paper about what Martin Luther King says about, violence, or Gandhi or whatever. It's another thing to look inside yourself and think, what do I believe? And so that's why we encourage people to start writing this stuff up now and sharing it with somebody who's trained in CO law to help you strengthen it and make it as good as it can be. Okay, so if you actually submit the application, like I say, you won't be drafted until they make a final decision. And if in the end they turn you down, they'll draft you into the military. If at the end they recognize you as a conscientious objector, then you would either be, well, if you're the kind of conscientious objector that's okay with doing military service as long as you don't have to kill somebody, you'd be drafted into the military, or you'd be drafted into alternative service. We're going to talk about those things in a little bit, but I first want to get into some detail about exactly what qualifies for conscientious objector status. Okay, because I quoted to you the law a little while ago that you must be conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form. Okay, so that is the actual definition, based on religious training and belief. Okay, so let's first of all let's talk about religious training and belief. Okay, going way back, like into the 50s, there was a question on the form that asked, do you believe in a supreme being? Because the law said it had to be based on religious training and belief. And there was a young man at the time, some of you may have met him, he's not so young anymore, Dan Seeger. Dan Seeger, his response to that question was to submit an essay on the knowability or unknowability of God. Okay, and draft board didn't like that. Okay, and he qualified for as a conscientious objector, except he didn't say yes to the question, do you believe in a supreme being? And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that he qualified as a conscientious objector. They struck down the supreme being clause. And, and so, they basically acknowledged that, religion doesn't necessarily have to believe in a supreme being, but still it had to be religious. And so in the late 60s, when I was dealing with it, one of the questions on the forum was, explain how your beliefs are religious. And I remember we played this game of, I looked up religion and I explained how Christianity fit within that definition. It was kind of a stupid thing we did. But along came Elliot Welsh, who basically refused to play that game. He said, I'm not religious. And his objection, he based his objection on ethical and moral beliefs. Dan Seeger actually says what he believed was pretty much what Dan believed, but the difference was that Dan said he was religious and Elliot said he wasn't religious. But in any case, that the same thing happened. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that ethical and moral beliefs qualify as well as religious beliefs. And of course, the Supreme Court was also concerned that now we're opening up the floodgates here, and what's going to come through. So they used words like, beliefs that are parallel to a belief in God, and beliefs that impart a duty of conscience, and beliefs that are so strong. They're in talking about Elliot Welsh, they said his beliefs are so strong that he would have no rest or peace if he were, to find himself in the military. And so they used this kind of wording to try to, explain how, the sincerity and depth of belief that someone must have to qualify as a conscientious objector. Okay, so ethical, but it's really clear that it has to be ethical and moral beliefs, and not political beliefs, and not expedient beliefs. I remember years ago I got a call from somebody who said, I got a nice car, I got a nice girlfriend, I don't believe I ought to go to war. And my response is, well, I don't believe you ought to go to war either, but that doesn't make you a conscientious objector. And political beliefs, and we encounter this a lot, especially, in the last decade or so, well, I don't want to, I think the war in Iraq is wrong, is based on lies of weapons of mass destruction. It's wrong. I'm not going to be a part of that war. Or we heard people saying, I don't want to be a part of, war for, Bush's war for oil. That was one of the phrases we heard a lot back in those days. And and so for folks whose objection seems to be political, I mean, those kinds of statements are political. What we encourage and what we try to help them do is to understand, well, what are the values that you hold that inform this political position, that cause you to think in this political way, and base the opposite and base the CO application on those values. I mean, it might be okay to bring up the politics a little, but you don't want to bring them up much, because because if there's too much politics in there, then the draft board might say, well, this is a political objection. So it's going to be important to address the values you hold that then inform your political perspective. So that's an important part of the element. Okay, it must be ethical or moral or religious in nature. Okay, the next thing is participation in war in any form. Okay, first of all, this is a statement. Your conscientious objector application is a statement about your participation in war. It's a you're going to write up a statement of your values and what you can or cannot do because of your values. Okay, and that's different from a treatise about how bad war is. Okay, I mean, and then we sometimes get that. We get people, their application, first draft of it is an anti-war, essay. Saying, well, that's not really what a CO application is. Okay, a CO application is about your values and what you can and cannot do because of your values, and more specifically, why you cannot be a part of war because of your values. Okay, the key wording is participation in war. Okay, so a lot of conscientious objectors, I mean, there are conscientious objectors who are completely opposed to all violence, but you don't have to be completely opposed to all violence. Okay, the law is you must be opposed to participation in war. Actually, one of my conscientious objectors, I was reading his application yesterday. We work with people in the military who become conscientious objectors, and he did an amazingly good job of talking about, if I was attacked, or if a loved one, or even just an innocent bystander nearby was attacked, I would do all I could to defend myself or defend these innocent victims. I wouldn't try to hurt the attacker, but I would want to do what I have to do to ensure the safety of people. And he said, but that's not war. And then he explained, the difference between that and war. And so that's a perfectly legitimate position for a conscientious objector to have. Then there are conscientious objectors who, are opposed to violence in that way. I've actually read some conscientious objector claims from some very religious people who say, in a situation like that, I would pray. And at least in a couple of these cases I'm thinking of, I believed that that's what they would do. I mean, they were so, wrapped up in their, religious beliefs that that would be their response, and that would be an honest answer for them. And like I'm more in line with the kinds of thinking of Martin Luther King, who talked about, violence always brings about more violence. Hatred always brings about more hatred. Love is the only force that's capable of, breaking this endless spiral of violence. And so, a violent response to anything, it would not be appropriate. And but each of you as conscientious objectors need to sort through these things for yourself and figure out where you come down. And then it's going to be important in your written application to show how your actions are consistent, with with those values that you've laid out there. At least your actions since you arrived at these values. Okay, I mean, it would not be appropriate for them to point to something you did before your values changed as an example of inconsistency, because those were not your values back then. But it is good. But they do have the right to look into whether your actions since your beliefs crystallized, is the wording they use, once they became solid in you, is your life consistent with those values since then? And so that's going to be among the things that the draft board is looking at. The other thing that we need to talk about is the phrase "war in any form," because that has been interpreted by the courts to mean that you can't pick and choose your wars. Like, you may remember, there was a lieutenant in the Army a decade or so ago who was ordered to Iraq, and he refused. He said it's an unjust war. But he said, but if I'd been ordered to Afghanistan, I would have gone. Okay, so that is what is commonly referred to as selective objection to a particular war rather than war in any form. And selective objection does not qualify for conscientious objector status under US law. Okay, the courts have said you can't pick and choose your wars. However, in the case of Gillette, that actually went to the Supreme Court, he was a selective objector. Although they ruled he did not qualify as a conscientious objector because he didn't object to war in any form, they also said, this is a direct quote, "Unwillingness to deny the possibility of a change of mind in some future hypothetical circumstances may be no more than humble good sense, and it casts no doubt on the claimant's present sincerity of belief." That's pretty important, okay? Because what we're talking about is you, the real person that exists in this time and place, coming to the conclusion that there is no such thing as a war that you could in good conscience participate in, that there is, within the realm of possibility that you envision, there's no such thing as a war that you can participate in. When you make that statement, you're not saying that you would have felt the same had you grown up, back in the 1930s and been faced with the prospect of Hitler rising in Germany. You're not saying that you'll never change your mind in the future if the world changes and your values change. You're making a statement about what you know and believe to be true now at this point in time. And let me just say that that's a good, this is an important, piece of advice to keep in mind, is that stick to what you know and don't speculate about what you don't know. Okay, and I'll tell you why. I mean, like when I was facing the draft during Vietnam, and the advice I was given was, well, you don't have to answer questions about World War II. You weren't around back then. Well, I knew about some cases where nonviolence had worked against Hitler and his army, and I was a relatively new true believer to nonviolence, that I was, very, emphatic about it. And so in answer to those questions about World War II, I talked to my draft board about how nonviolence had worked against Hitler. I just pissed them off. I mean, they were all World War II veterans, and they did not want to hear that. Okay. And in retrospect, uh, I would have been, it would have been better for me probably to say I don't know, because the truth is I wasn't around back then, and I don't know, and I'm actually, now that I look back on it, I think I wonder what these guys must have thought of this, 20-year-old kid, thinking he knew how to respond to Hitler when he wasn't even alive back then, and whereas these folks had all been part of a war against Hitler. And so this is an important, piece of advice for folks. I mean, stick to your beliefs, certainly, but try to avoid having them get you to speculate about things you don't know. Okay. I mean, in all honesty, I now know much more than I did when I was 20. And, and I don't, and I still feel the way I did then, fundamentally, and I am aware that, and this would be I think probably an okay answer for folks is to say, look, I don't know where I'd have been had I been or had I been around back then. I know that lots of people went to war and thought that was the right thing to do. I also know that there were thousands of conscientious objectors who did alternative service. And I also know that there were thousands of people who resisted the draft entirely and went to jail to be true to their conscience. And I honestly don't know where I would have been among them had I been around back then, because I wasn't. And that's probably a wise, approach for that. But but that's what's important is you stick to your values and what you know to be true, and don't allow them to get you speculating about things that you don't really know or think you might know. I don't know. Um, uh, CCCO, which is a group that's been defunct for over a decade now, but back in the day, it was a very, very good group that supported conscientious objectors. And they used to put out a handbook for conscientious objectors. And this is a quote from that handbook that I think addresses this issue really, really well. Okay. Some will fight only when Allah commands, and Allah remains silent. Some will fight only in Armageddon, which seems to always lie in the future. Some would fight if there were no nuclear weapons, but there are. Some would fight if certain theoretical criteria could be met, but they can't be. In the meantime, these people may find themselves conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form, and can say so honestly. I want people to keep that in mind, because you need to talk about what you know and the reality of war today, and not what war might be like in some future. I mean, back in the 80s, the geniuses at the Pentagon were working on something called the neutron bomb. And this was a bomb that would emit, I think, radioactive waves or something like that. But if they dropped it on a city, it would do relatively little damage to the physical structure of the city, but it would kill all the people. And and I remember back then I used to say something like, well, if they ever invent the opposite of the neutron bomb, a bomb that destroys property but doesn't hurt anybody, maybe I'd feel differently about war. But that's not the real world we live in. And that's what you need to be doing is talking about the real world we live in, real war as it is now, and where you come down on that, and how you feel about that, and whether you can in good conscience be a part of it. So that's I think that kind of covers the definition of a conscientious objector. Now, when you apply for conscientious objector status, okay, first of all, there's that small window of time, no matter which system they use. There's going to be a small window of time in which you make your initial claim, at which point they will send you the CO form and give you about 10 days to fill that out and send it back. And once you do that, then you will be scheduled for a hearing before you can also get letters of support, which is always good to do, and if you're involved with the church, get a letter from your minister, if you're, maybe some of the teachers you've had that, have influenced you, that you've had serious conversations about these issues. maybe friends. I mean, try to get a range of letters, but get some letters of support so you have some documentation. And then once you submit your application, they will schedule you for a draft board hearing. You will have to go for a hearing in front of the draft board. The regulations are really clear that if you don't go to the hearing, they will rule that you have abandoned your conscientious objector claim and you will not be given CO status. So it's going to be important to make it to the draft board hearing. You can also bring up to 3 witnesses with you to the hearing, and you could also bring an advisor, somebody like me or one of your teachers who are getting trained in this, to be an advisor throughout that process. And of course, when you go before the draft board, of course, I've mentioned some of the things that happened to me at my draft board hearing, but it's basically a chance for them to ask you all sorts of questions that presumably, come out of your written document. But as I think I mentioned, if you base it on traditional Christian thinking, they're gonna probably throw all sorts of Bible verses at you that would seem to justify war. So it's going to be important that you do some thinking about those things. But whatever the basis of your claim is, they're going to be asking questions about trying to find your consistency and things like that. I mean, in theory, they're supposed to be finding out whether you qualify. Depending on their own biases, they may just be looking for a reason to turn you down, but in any case, you go before the draft board and, they have this hearing and your witnesses, and then the draft board will make a decision. And if they grant your status, then it'll be time for you to, go into alternative service or non-combatant military service. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But if they turn you down, then you have the right to appeal. And you should appeal to the district appeal board. They correspond to federal judicial districts. And basically the rules are the same at the appeal board, except you can't bring any witnesses. And one of the things that we strongly recommend that you do at the end of your draft board hearing, because they, like I say, they're going to ask all sorts of questions. You're going to do your best to answer these questions, and you want to be genuine when you're talking to the draft board. You don't want to come across as trying to outsmart them or, address some kind of, the issue is, what do you believe? Okay. And so you want to come across as genuine. You're not trying to convince them that you're right. You're trying to convince them that you sincerely believe that it's wrong for you to participate in war. Okay, but if, so once that hearing is over, what we recommend you do, because you're not allowed to record the hearing, is that you want to write up a very detailed account of what happened in that hearing. The questions that were asked and how you answered them. Not how you wish you had answered them, but how you actually answered them, so that there is an accurate record of what happened there. What you could also do to make this easier would be have a recorder in your car, and as soon as you leave, just talking to the recorder, describing everything that happened, and then transcribe that. And then what you could and should do is send that in to the draft board. You can submit things, and I would submit that to say, I want this to be included in my CO file. This is my summary of what happened at the hearing. And here's the important part. You say, if anything is inaccurate, according to your memory, please let me know, immediately or within 20 days or 15 days, whatever. That's for your protection in case it later ends up somewhere, in court or something, and the draft board's member says, well, that's not what happened. It's like, well, the record says this. Why didn't you say something back then? Okay, so those are some things that you could do to protect yourself. And of course, you want to appeal to the appeal board if you get turned down. And you can have a personal appearance at the appeal board also. So request it. and and pretty much the rules are the same, except that you won't be able to have hearing. You won't be able to have witnesses testify, but you will still be able to have an advisor. And but the same thing at the end of that hearing, it'll be similar to the local board hearing. The appeal board will then make a decision about whether to grant you CO status or not. And again, if they grant you that, then you go on to do your service. If they turn you down, unanimously, in other words, if every member of the appeal board votes no, then that's the end of your appeals, your formal appeals in the system. But if just one person votes in your favor, then you can appeal to the National Appeal Board. And it's often called an appeal to the president, but it's actually the National Appeal Board you appeal to. Same thing, you do have the right to a hearing there. And all the rules there are the same, except that's the last appeal within the normal system. Now, if they're still turned down, and if you're still turned down, and then you can try some informal appeals. You can work with us or some other counselor to try to reach out to the director of selective service to have them intervene in your case, because the director actually can change your classification if he is so inclined. It's always been a he. It might be a she someday, but as of now, it's always been a he. And but that's basically the process. Okay. But assuming you, and of course, the other thing is, you may qualify for other classifications, hardship or, other things that, medical issues, that may also take precedent over your conscientious objector application, because the way the selective service system is set up, if you qualify for any other deferment or exemption under draft law, they're going to give you that instead of conscientious objection. Okay, so that is the way the regs are set up. So, but for conscientious objectors, I think we've gone through the process for conscientious objectors, and if you get to that point, and you, well, if you're turned down, and if those final appeals don't work, then you're going to have to, do some serious soul searching about, what you're going to do if you actually are drafted. I mean, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but for a serious conscientious objector who objects to being in the military, going into the military is not really an option. I remember the draft board asking me that, and coming to the realization, well, I guess I might go to jail over this if they're not going to recognize me as a CO. But that's something that each of you is going to have to, sort out for yourselves. But I think for most conscientious objectors, going into the military is not an option, and there may be various ways that to deal with that. But most common, I think, would be refusing induction. And at that point, it'll be up to the government whether or not they want to prosecute you. And the same thing, failure to report for induction is the same as not registering. Well, I think it's more likely to get prosecuted, but it's maximum 5 years and $250,000 fine. And we don't know what the future holds and what the courts are going to do. I mentioned that there were 20 people prosecuted back in the 1980s for not registering. About half of them went to jail, but nobody was in jail more than 6 months, and about half of them got community service. I won't get into all the details, but that's roughly what happened to them. During the Vietnam period, there were people who got 5-year sentences, including multiple 5-year sentences, like Walter Collins, who is African-American and was from Louisiana, and his family was very involved in the civil rights movement, so they were not real sympathetic to him or his opposition to war. And when they turned him down and issued him an order to report for induction, he refused. They sent him 5 different orders to report for induction. He didn't go at any of them. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years for each refusal. So he got a 25-year sentence. He did not spend 25 years in jail, but he was in jail for a couple of years. And I can't think of anybody offhand who spent more time in jail, or there might have been some, but if so people need to realize, if you're at that point of saying no, it's a pretty serious commitment that you're potentially making. However, the other thing you need to know is, and again, we can't say what the future holds, but in the past, during the Vietnam period, when the draft was active and people got to this point where they refused induction, in over half the cases of people who refused induction, that's the last they ever heard from the government about this, okay? Upon a review of the case, the Department of Justice would either say, well, it's not a high priority case, or it's pretty clear from the record here, the draft board screwed up by not granting this person CO status. And since the draft law says there's no authority to draft conscientious objectors, what the government has to prove is that the draft board did the proper thing by turning down the CO application. And so in over half the cases, the government did not prosecute. That was the end of it. And in the almost half where the government did prosecute, the government lost over 90% of those cases, because the lawyers who defended conscientious objectors were able to show how the draft board had acted improperly in one way or another. And so this induction order should never have been issued. So that's an option for folks, but of course there's a risk. And one of the reasons you want to do all this work we talked about earlier, about creating a file and doing the best job you can on your application, is to avoid being put in that position, because it's not a position that you want to be in. But if it comes to that, then there is a support network that will be there to support you the best that we can. So that's a little bit about that process. Now, I want to move into what happens for people who are approved, because that's another part of conscientious objection that's pretty important. But before we go there, I want to share with you a video of, it's only about 5 or 6 minutes, of a young man that we worked with a number of years ago, Josh Castile. I mean, as I said, there hasn't been a draft in like an active draft in 50 years. So the conscientious objectors that we're working with now are people who are in the military and then come to the realization that what they're doing is wrong and that they need to be discharged. And that's an ongoing piece of work that we're actually quite busy with right now. We have a lot of cases like this. And this is and I just want to share you the story of Josh Castile, because it's a pretty powerful story, and hopefully will be inspiring to all of you. Where is he? Oh, here he comes.
grew up in an evangelical household, an evangelical Christian household. I grew up hearing stories about the nobility of service. I was the president of the Young Republicans. I used to carry a copy of the Constitution around with me. I received a 4-year ROTC scholarship and an appointment to West Point. 1997, the summer of 97, I go to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, boot camp. And we go out to the bayonet assault course. And the drill sergeant would rally us all up and he would say, "What's the spirit of the bayonet?" And we'd say, "Kill, kill, kill without mercy, Sergeant." And he'd say, "What makes the green grass grow?" And we'd say, "Blood, blood, bright red blood, Sergeant." And for a kid who grew up in evangelical Christianity, as much as we might be patriotic, there's something that doesn't quite sit right. I was thinking about the stories in Sunday school of a gentle Jesus. In the Gospels, it says, if a man strikes you on the left cheek, turn him also your right. I had started to ask questions about redemption. What would it look like if that same determination that's used to defeat the enemy is used to redeem the enemy? I was at Abu Ghraib for about 6 months total of interrogation time. When I wasn't at the interrogation center, when I was on my free time, I spent a lot of time in the chapel praying. I was interrogating schoolboys, young fathers, imams, average people taken off the streets and put into my interrogation booth. Finally, 5 months into my time at Abu Ghraib, I had an interrogation with a man who was a self-proclaimed jihadist. He told me that he had a certain peace because of his faith in Islam, that if it was the will of God for him to stay in prison, and if he never was released, that he would be okay with that. And he challenged me, wondering if I had that same kind of peace in my life, wondering if I had the same kind of spiritual centeredness to take that kind of fate. He then started talking about Jesus, that I wasn't fulfilling the call to turn the other cheek, to love one's enemies. I took a little bit offense to this comment because it came from the mouth of a self-proclaimed jihadist who told me that he would kill me if he had the chance. But something had definitely occurred within me. When posed with that kind of challenge, I had nothing I could say to him. I absolutely agreed with him. My position as a U.S. Army interrogator contradicted my calling simply as a Christian, and it hindered my ability to do things like love my enemies. I stopped the interrogation. I'd lost all perspective as a soldier. I wanted to ask him about his willingness to kill me. I wanted to ask him about the peace that he found in his religion, and if there could possibly be a way to get outside of the cycle of vengeance, that he and I could share a path. In the regulation governing conscientious objection, there's an element that they call the crystallization of conscience, and every CO applicant has to state what that was for them. And the interrogation with that jihadist was my crystallization of conscience. And it wasn't that a bunch of new beliefs suddenly emerged out of nowhere. I realized for me to follow Christ involves taking seriously the charge for peacemaking. In the beginning of February 2005, I formally submitted my application to be considered a conscientious objector. My application was approved, and by the 30th of May, I was out of the Army.
Wow. So that's the story of Josh, who, as you heard, did get an honorable discharge, and just shows, the intensity and power of, and how important these issues really are. Josh, I mean, what can I say? Josh, in that process, converted to Catholicism, and he actually went to seminary. He was planning to become a priest. But I don't know if you've all heard about the open burn pits in Iraq, which created a lot of health problems for a lot of people. And once they took Josh out of the interrogation room, they had him tending these burn pits, and he died from the cancer that he got from his being in Iraq and being exposed to those chemicals. But Josh is an inspiration, and he's a pretty, but that's one of many conscientious objectors in the military that our office has worked with over the years. The one thing about his story that might be a little different for folks facing the draft who are conscientious objectors is that for conscientious objectors in the military, they are required to show how their beliefs crystallized after they joined the military. As a guy, actually the CO application I mentioned earlier that I was reading just yesterday, he starts out saying, well, if I believed this all along, I wouldn't be here, and that's exactly the point. If you folks are facing potential draft, and so you need to show, as your beliefs, as deeply and as long, and if you can show a long held belief, for example, being raised in a friend's meeting where you were exposed to the peace testimony, from childhood, even though they're not supposed to give preference to one religion or another, the reality is that they do sometimes, because everyone knows about the Quaker peace testimony. We actually had draft board members in the past who would say, well, we got a lot of Mennonites in this area. We have to give it to those Mennonites, but we're not going to give it to anybody else. So even though they're not supposed to give preference to a religion over another, they often do. And, so showing, if it's true for you, I mean, don't lie about it, okay? But if it's true for you that this is, building on values you've had since childhood, you want to talk about those things. That long-standing belief helps, helps in your credibility, helps to be convincing to the draft board. Whereas for people in the military, they have to show how their beliefs have changed since they joined. Because if they believed this, they wouldn't have joined. Okay, so that's the main difference between somebody like Josh and people like you who are considering being conscientious objectors to the draft. Okay, the final part of this session is going to be to talk a little bit about what happens when you are approved. What do conscientious objectors do? And I mean, like if you had a medical disqualification from the military, then you wouldn't be required to do anything. You would have a deferment or an exemption, whereas a conscientious objectors uh, don't get exempted from anything. Okay, if their number comes up, they are still required to serve, and they serve either in the military as a non-combatant or in alternative service as a civilian. Now, I will say that most people apply for the alternative service as a civilian. Okay, most conscientious objectors do not feel, that they could perform, non-combatant duties in the military, and so they apply for the civilian service. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, but the movie Hacksaw Ridge is about a conscientious objector in World War II who went into the military as a non-combatant. Um, but um, but basically, those who go into the military as a non-combatant, according to the law, I mean, basically, they would never be required to carry a weapon or use a weapon or be trained in the use of weapons. But aside from that, they would be full and regular members of the military. And that doesn't mean, you would never see combat. Okay. In fact, the most common assignment to conscientious objectors historically has been to the medical corps. And as medics, as battlefield medics, people are right on the front lines. And normally medics carry weapons, but conscientious objectors who are medics do not carry weapons. And actually, that movie, Hacksaw Ridge, is about Desmond Doss, who in fact was right on the front lines and saved many lives. But so folks need to understand that being a non-combatant in the military, you might still find yourself in the middle of a battlefield. You also need to be aware that, just because you're promised that you won't be required to carry a weapon, that doesn't mean in the heat of battle, some officer doesn't say to you, hey, soldier, pick up that soldier and use it, which we know has happened. So for some of those reasons, people in the military, I mean, people who are conscientious objectors feel they can't go into the military. Probably the biggest issue. Obviously, a lot of one of my conscientious objectors, just her hearing was a couple of weeks ago, and he was asking her, and her actually job was explosive ordnance destruction. She thought she had actually tried to rearrange her job, figuring, okay, rather than being in this more combatant thing, I will get into this other field where what we're doing is disarming bombs. That would be a good thing. She really tried to make it work. And she came to realize that we're not out here disarming bombs to save civilians. What we're doing is disarming these things so the infantry can move in and do their job. And as she said numerous times in her hearing, in response to questions, the Navy is not a humanitarian organization. Where her reason for being is to fight in war and be successful in war. And even if my job is not overtly doing that fighting, that's still fundamentally what it's about. I mean, and that's why many people, do not apply for the non-combatant military service, because they see that compromise. And in particular, it shows itself in battlefield triage. Okay, now triage, in case you're not familiar with the term, it refers to medical sorting. Okay, for example, if there was a bus or a train accident and there are lots of injured people, then the first responders, they get there, you can't possibly take care of everybody at once. So you sort folks, and the critical but savable people are at the top of the list, and people with minor injuries, they can wait and get taken care of later, and things like that. Well, the military turns that on its head in a sense. I mean, well, because the purpose of the military is to fight wars, and because the purpose of the medical corps is to keep the troops in good physical shape so that they can fight most efficiently. Battlefield triage puts people with minor injuries at the top of the list because they can be patched up quickly and put back up on the front lines. And then you get to the more critically injured who might have been saved had you gotten to them first, who may have died in the meantime. And so for people of conscience, a lot of people have trouble with that way of doing a medical sorting. So even though being a medic, which on its surface appears like a humanitarian and compassionate kind of thing to be doing, has this other side to it, which a lot of people object to. So you need to think carefully about whether those are the kinds of things that you can do, because as I've said many times, every job in the military, even if all you're doing is sweeping the halls at the Pentagon, somehow is facilitating the ability of the country to wage war, or else you wouldn't be doing it. So that's why a lot of people, instead of doing the non-combatant service in the military, choose to do alternative service. And when you're applying for conscientious objector status, you apply for one or the other. And you actually might get some questions. I remember my draft board asking me some questions about, well, why couldn't you be a medic in the military? And I had to explain to them something similar to what I just said to you all. But that's certainly going to come up. You're going to be asked about that if you're going before a draft board. So people who get approved to be conscientious, the official term is a 1-0 conscientious objector, but a conscientious objector who's going to do alternative service. Okay, then there's basically 5 areas. Okay, I mean, the law says it must be work in the national health, safety, and interest. That's what the law says. And the regulations specify 5 areas of work: education, healthcare, agriculture, environmental protection, and social and community services. So you'd be required to work for 2 years in one of those fields in a job that Selective Service approved. And then there's a whole process, that once somebody becomes a conscientious objector, there's a questionnaire they need to fill out, showing, what their interests and skills and training is. And then then there's going to be a bank of jobs that are potentially available. And if you don't take any initiative on your own, Selective Service will do a computer matchup to try to find you, the right job, and they will order you to go to job, interviews and things like that. But the idea is to have you placed in a job within a matter of weeks of when you were approved as a conscientious objector. But here's the important part that you need to know, is the regulations say that a conscientious objector can pick their own job. If a conscientious objector finds a job that qualifies under the law, and I just described to you what the law requires, and if the employer wants to hire them as a conscientious objector to do that job, then that's where they will be assigned. That is the first priority. So, so this would allow a conscientious objector to choose their job, assuming the job, fit within, the definition that was allowed. And of course, we never know how these things are going to change our lives. There are a number of folks who, for example, I mentioned in World War II, how the conscientious objectors, revolutionized, how mental health is done in this country. Well, a number of them went on to fields, careers in the mental health field. And And similarly, even during the Vietnam period, some of the job placement, some of the jobs they had for their alternative service seemed like a good fit, and they continued to work there, or in that field, after they were no longer required to do their service with selective service. But basically, there's a process where you, as the conscientious objector, have to, you have to report. The job has to be at least 35 hours a week. You're expected to perform adequately. The employer is required to report to selective service that you're doing well. And basically, once your 2 years is up, then you will be officially, relieved of your obligation to serve, and you'll have a draft classification that says that you performed your service and have completed your service. Trying to think. I mean, back during the Vietnam period, they were not nearly as well, as you heard from World War II, they put people in camps. Things got better after that. They were trying to sort all this out during the Korean period, and really were fumbling trying to figure out how to do alternative service, because they didn't want to do the CO camps again. And by the Vietnam period, they had it kind of down, but they also treated it in a way as a punitive kind of assignment. Okay, they want to do they actually had a rule. It was called the 50-mile rule, where they wanted you to be assigned to a job that was at least 50 miles from where you lived, to inconvenience you in the same way that people get drafted are inconvenienced and get sent off to boot camp or to war or whatever. The current selective service plans are not like that. They've been real clear that we don't think of alternative service as anything punitive at all. And it sounds like they really want to help people get into jobs that really do, meet their interests and skills, so they can really, do something that will make a difference in their communities, and also then fulfill their obligation under the draft law. So that is, I think that's the gist of what we had to cover today. I'm looking forward to Saturday, when we're going to have time to talk about these things with each other. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And if there's anything that we've covered here that I skimmed over too quickly, or that you didn't understand, I want to make sure that you get your answers, learn everything that you need to. But I thank you for joining with me. I know it's probably not, well, you could have taken a break whenever you wanted, but I hope this has been worthwhile for you, and I really look forward to our time together on Saturday. And be well. Take care.